My husband is not a dramatic person. In 11 years of marriage, he has never once sent me a message designed to alarm me or asked me to avoid something without a reason ready or said anything that required me to brace myself before responding. He is steady in the way that only certain people manage to be, not boring, just reliable, the kind of person you anchor your life to because they don't move unexpectedly, which is why when I picked up my phone at 7:13 on a Tuesday morning and saw his text, I felt something cold move through my chest before I even finished reading it. 6 words. Don't read today's news, please. Not call me, not I can explain, not any of the things a person says when there's actually a plan in place. Just a text with the word please at the end of it, which told me he'd sent it knowing it might not work. I put the phone down. I picked it up again. I set it back on the nightstand and got up and made coffee like a person who was not going to open the news. I lasted 8 minutes. Then I opened it. And there was my husband's name in a headline I read 3 times because my brain kept refusing to process it. My name is Rachel. I'm 38 and I've been married to my husband Tom for 11 years. We have 2 kids, Owen, 9, and Cora, 6. Tom works in finance, institutional investments, the kind of work that is genuinely difficult to explain at dinner parties and that I stopped trying to explain years ago. He leaves early, comes home at a reasonable hour, coaches Owen's weekend soccer team, makes better pancakes than I do. He is, by every available measure, a good man living a good life. That Tuesday morning, he'd left before I was fully awake. Not unusual. His coffee cup was in the drying rack when I came downstairs. His jacket was gone from the hook. Everything was normal. My phone buzzed at 7:13 and the normal stopped. I want to be honest about the 8 minutes I spent not opening the news. I spent them running through scenarios, everything from minor embarrassment to something career-ending to something that would require a lawyer. I told myself I was being rational. I was being afraid. Those are not always different things. Then I opened my phone and typed 2 words into the search bar. Tom's name. The headline wasn't what I expected. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't anything in the categories my fear had been sorting through for 8 minutes. A financial newspaper had published an investigative piece, the kind that takes months to research, the kind with named sources and documented timelines, about a whistleblower who had, 18 months earlier, anonymously flagged a series of compliance violations at a firm Tom had worked for 4 years before we met. The violations were significant, the kind that had eventually led to regulatory action and fines. The story itself was not new. The part that was new was this. The piece named the whistleblower. It was Tom, not accused of wrongdoing, identified as the person who had reported it. The person who had, before I knew him, before our kids, before the house and the soccer team and the pancakes, walked into a regulatory office and handed over documentation that ended his career at that firm, damaged several relationships he'd built over years, and set off a chain of events that had quietly followed him for the better part of a decade. I read the article twice. Then I read the comments, which I immediately wished I hadn't. Then I closed my phone and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his coffee cup still in the drying rack. My husband had done something that cost him significantly, quietly, without telling me, years before I ever knew his name. He called at 8:40. I let it ring once, caught myself, and answered. He asked if I'd read it. I said yes. He said he was sorry I'd found out this way. I said I wished I'd found out a different way a long time ago, and he said, I know. He came home early. We sent the kids to his mother's without explaining much, and we sat in the living room in the specific configuration of 2 people who have something important to say and aren't sure who should go first. He went first. He told me the story in a way the article hadn't, from the inside. He'd been 29, 3 years into a job he'd worked hard for, when he'd discovered that people he worked directly under were falsifying risk disclosures in ways that would eventually hurt clients, not abstract clients, real people, pension funds, retirement accounts. He'd raised it internally first. He'd been told in clear enough terms to let it go. He hadn't let it go. What followed was a year of documentation, legal consultation, the particular loneliness of doing something that most people in your position wouldn't do, and the professional fallout that came after. Not immediate, not dramatic, but slow and steady and damaging in the way that reputations in small industries erode when the wrong people decide you're not worth trusting. He'd rebuilt. It had taken years. By the time he met me, he said, it felt like something that belonged so firmly to a previous chapter that opening it into a new relationship felt like leading with the worst and most exhausting year of his life. He said he hadn't told me because every year that passed made telling me feel less necessary and more disruptive. And then enough years had passed that telling me felt like it would require explaining why he'd waited so long, which was a conversation inside a conversation he didn't know how to start. I asked him if he regretted what he'd done, the original decision, the report, all of it. He said no, without hesitation. I believed him. I want to be honest about what I felt and in what order, because the order matters. First, relief, which surprised me because I hadn't known I was braced for something worse until I found out what it actually was. Second, something like pride, which felt strange given the circumstances but was real. Third, and this one took longer, frustration. Not at what he'd done. I couldn't be frustrated at a 29-year-old who'd made a costly ethical decision and paid for it. I was frustrated at 11 years of living with someone who'd carried a piece of his own history without showing it to me. Not because it changed anything, but because it meant there were years where he'd been managing something alone that he didn't have to manage alone anymore. I told him that. I said he'd been living with this by himself since before I knew him, and that was his right, but that somewhere in the last 11 years there had been a point where it became ours, and he'd missed it. He sat with that for a while. He said I was right. He also said the text at 7:13 was the closest he'd come to telling me on his own terms, that he'd known the story was coming, had known for 2 weeks, and every day had been the day he was going to say it first, and every day he hadn't, until Tuesday morning when a journalist did it instead. I asked him why he'd sent "don't read" instead of "we need to talk." He said he'd hoped for about 30 seconds that I wouldn't. I told him he knows me better than that. He said, I know. That's why I added please. The article ran, created a brief wave of attention in the financial world, and then disappeared the way things disappear when the next story arrives. Tom's current firm reached out, not with concern, with the support. 2 people he hadn't spoken to since that year called him the week after. One of them apologized for not doing what he'd done when they'd had the chance. We've talked about it more since, the original decision, the years after, what it cost and what it didn't, the reasons he kept it as long as he kept it. Those conversations happen quietly, over dinner, after the kids are in bed. The particular texture of learning something new about someone you thought you knew completely. I've stopped being frustrated. What's left is something simpler. The understanding that the person I married had already been tested seriously at a point before I knew him, and had made a choice I'm proud of, even though he made it before I was there to say so. He sent me 6 words at 7:13 to keep me from finding out. I'm glad I opened it anyway. Some things you need to read even when someone who loves you asks you not to.